Get ready for the story that will make you rethink what really goes on behind classroom doors. And if you like these stories, don't forget to subscribe. It was just another Monday morning at Westbrook High, and the sound of lockers slamming shut, shoes echoing on linoleum floors, and chatter filled the air as students gathered in the hallway, heading to their classes. It was a new semester, and the excitement of seeing old friends and meeting new ones buzzed in the air like static. Amara Williams stood at her locker, adjusting the strap of her backpack, the weight of the books pulling her shoulders down slightly. Her long, dark braids cascaded down her back, and her brown eyes sparkled with curiosity. At 16, she'd learned to navigate the halls of Westbrook with grace, but today, there was something in the air that felt off, something she couldn't yet put her finger on. Amara was one of only a handful of black students at Westbrook, a predominantly white school in the quiet suburbs. She'd dealt with the occasional whisper, the offhand comment, and the sideways glances for most of her life. But as the daughter of Principal Williams, she had always felt protected, at least within the walls of her father's office. Her father, Michael Williams, was a man of integrity and respect, always fighting for what was right. However, the corridors outside his office were a different world. As Amara made her way to English class, the bell rang sharply, signaling the start of the period. The students filed in, chatting, laughing, and taking their seats. The last person to walk in was Miss Clara Hawkins, a new addition to the faculty. She was a woman in her early 40s, with platinum blonde hair that had a crisp, almost icy quality to it. Her blue eyes were sharp, and her smile was tight, not quite reaching her eyes. Amara had heard a few rumors about Miss Hawkins, mostly from the other students, about her strictness and her no-nonsense attitude. But Amara didn't let those things bother her. She'd faced enough challenges to know that people were often more complicated than the rumors they were shrouded in. Amara took her usual seat near the front, where she could keep her focus. Miss Hawkins began the class with a brief introduction, outlining the semester's objectives. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the usual chatter, but Amara remained unfazed. She had learned to focus in the midst of distractions, especially from teachers who hadn't always been kind or considerate. "Let's begin with a quick icebreaker," Miss Hawkins said, her voice suddenly taking on a more artificial sweetness. "I want you all to introduce yourselves and tell the class one interesting fact about yourself." Students began to speak in turn, some giving typical answers: favorite hobbies, sports, or movies. When it came time for Amara, she cleared her throat and stood up. "I'm Amara Williams," she said softly, her voice clear but quiet. "I like to read and write, and I'm a big fan of photography." Miss Hawkins tilted her head, raising an eyebrow slightly. "Interesting," she said, her voice dripping with something Amara couldn't quite place. "You seem quiet, Amara. Are you sure you don't have anything more interesting to share?" The class chuckled, some awkwardly, unsure whether it was a joke or a veiled insult. Amara felt a sudden tension in her chest, but refused to let it show. She offered a small smile, sitting back down as Ms. Hawkins continued the introductions. When the icebreaker ended, Ms. Hawkins began the lesson, but Amara noticed something strange. The teacher kept looking at her, almost as though she were waiting for something. Every time she raised her hand to answer a question, Ms. Hawkins would pause, scrutinize her, and then either dismiss her answer or ask a follow-up question designed to undermine her confidence. It was subtle at first, the small jabs, the pointed comments, but Amara, despite her quiet demeanor, was not blind. She knew when something wasn't right. Days passed, and the interactions between Ms. Hawkins and Amara grew more tense. During group discussions, Amara's contributions were often ignored or downplayed. She was criticized for being too quiet or not participating enough. Yet when other students spoke up, their opinions were validated, sometimes even praised. One particular incident stood out. The class was discussing a novel, and Amara had offered a well-thought-out analysis of a character's motivations. Ms. Hawkins, however, chose to highlight a white student's interpretation, calling it more insightful. "Amara, I'm not sure you're fully grasping the nuances here," Ms. Hawkins had said, her tone condescending. "Maybe if you spoke up more, we'd be able to see the real depth of your understanding. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Amara's face flushed, her hands tightening around the edges of her notebook. It wasn't just the dismissal of her answer that stung. It was the implication that her voice didn't matter. That her thoughts, her intelligence, were secondary to others. The next day, Amara's father, Principal Michael Williams, entered the classroom. He had received an anonymous complaint about Miss Hawkins's behavior and had come to observe her teaching firsthand. As he walked into the room, the atmosphere shifted. Students sat straighter, and even Miss Hawkins seemed to stiffen, her usual sharpness replaced by a tense politeness. "Good morning, everyone," Principal Williams said, his voice carrying authority but warmth. "I'm just here to sit in on the class today. Please continue as usual." Amara tried not to make eye contact with her father, knowing that his presence would make things even more complicated. As the class continued, Miss Hawkins made an obvious effort to change her approach, but Amara could feel the coldness still lingering in her words. The turning point came a week later. Amara had worked hard on an essay about race and identity, a topic that resonated deeply with her. It was a personal exploration, one she had poured her heart into. When it was time to hand in the papers, she hesitated. Ms. Hawkins had been openly critical of her in class, but Amara couldn't let that stop her from submitting her work. So she handed it in, knowing full well what might happen next. The following class, Ms. Hawkins handed the papers back. Amara took hers with a nervous glance, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped it open. The red ink was everywhere. Too emotional, not objective enough. This essay lacks the analytical rigor needed for a high school assignment, the teacher had written in bold letters across the top of the page. Amara's heart sank. She had written from her own experiences, hoping to offer a perspective that would be heard. But Ms. Hawkins had dismissed it with a few words, almost as though she didn't care to understand. Before Amara could react, Ms. Hawkins announced, "Amara, would you stay after class for a moment?" The words hung in the air like a threat. When the bell rang, Amara lingered behind, her heart racing. Ms. Hawkins waited until the last student had filed out before addressing her. "You know," Ms. Hawkins said, her voice sweetly patronizing, "I'm just trying to push you to do better. Your paper was a bit too emotional. Maybe you need to separate your feelings from your work." Amara stood there, silent for a moment before she spoke. "My feelings are a part of who I am, and if I can't express that, then what's the point?" Ms. Hawkins gave her a tight-lipped smile. "We'll see if your father agrees with that approach." Amara's chest tightened at the mention of her father. She knew what Ms. Hawkins was implying, but she refused to be intimidated. "I'll be sure to let him know about your feedback." As Amara left the classroom, she could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. She knew it wouldn't end here. The following morning, Principal Williams was in the classroom again, but this time, he wasn't just observing. He had come to address a specific issue. The complaint from Amara had reached him, and he had taken it seriously. As Miss Hawkins began her lesson, Principal Williams walked in with a stern expression, his presence immediately commanding attention. "Miss Hawkins," he said, "I'd like to have a word." The conversation between them was brief, but it was enough. When Ms. Hawkins tried to argue, Principal Williams stood firm, making it clear that such behavior would not be tolerated in his school. He reminded her that every student deserved respect, regardless of their background. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the classroom shifted. Ms. Hawkins became less confrontational, though the underlying tension remained. Amara no longer felt the need to shrink or second-guess herself. With her father's support, she was able to find her voice again, not just in class, but in life. The lessons were not just about literature or essays. They were about standing up for what was right, no matter how difficult it seemed. And in the end, Amara realized that sometimes the hardest battles were fought not with fists, but with words.